Hi, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is chapter 6 of part 2. Resting in Messiah, the major began longing to see his family. I feel terribly over missing my son's most interesting period of development, but this separation can't last forever, he wrote Ethel on October 9th. I get so terribly homesick at times that I just don't see how I could stand it. The Taft administration had another unpleasant assignment for him, rigging the new Nicaraguan elections to make certain that Diaz was returned to power. Checking on the country's election laws, Butler found that the polls had to be open a sufficient length of time. At least that's the way we translated it, and that voters had to register to be able to vote. Ordered to canvass the district to locate 4,000 or 400 Nicaraguans who could be depended upon to vote for Diaz. Notice of opening of the polls was given 5 minutes beforehand. The 400 Diaz adherents were assembled in a line, and 2 hours later, as soon as they had finished voting, the polls were closed. Other citizens had either failed to register or didn't know balloting was going on. Today, Butler wrote Ethel sardonically, Nicaragua has enjoyed a fine free election, with only one candidate being allowed to run, President Adolfo Diaz, who was unanimously elected. In order that this happy event might be pulled off without hitch, and to the entire satisfaction of our State Department, we patrolled all the towns to prevent disorders, and of course there were none. He consoled himself by reflecting that the constant revolutions in Central American politics did not represent a struggle for power by the people themselves, but were most often simply attempts by rascals out of office to overthrow rascals in office. He had a high regard for the Nicaraguan people and genuine compassion for their suffering. On November 13th, 1912, over 5,000 Nicaraguans turned out in Granada to present him with a gold medal for saving them from troop disorders and looting. They also gave him a scroll signed by Granada's leading citizens expressing gratitude for his brave and opportune intervention that put an end to the desperate and painful situation in which this city was placed, victim of all the horrors and of an organized anarchy. End quote. They told him, quote, from this terrible situation and from the anguish that the future held for us, we passed as by magic a state of complete guarantee for life, property, and well-being for all, as well as the American troops entered the city. The tact and discretion with which you fulfilled your humane mission, so bristling with difficulties, was such that your name will be forever engraved in the hearts of the people. End quote. There were fireworks and a fiesta. The whole thing was very impressive and made me feel quite silly, he wrote sheepishly to his wife, but rather proud for my darling's sakes. A People's Committee urged him to stay on as police commissioner of the district. The 29-year-old major found himself intrigued by the prospect of introducing honest law enforcement in Granada. What would thee think, he wrote Ethel, of my accepting a $15,000 job as chief of this police down here, not to leave the Marine Corps, but to have a 3 years leave? Finally, he decided against it. Despite his reservations about the ethics of the Nicaraguan campaign, it had filled him with exhilaration of adventure. This is the end of the expedition, he wrote his wife. Would like to have some parts of it over again. The excitement was fine. He indicated an early awareness that he was destined to play a meaningful role in American history, Be sure to keep all my letters, as they are a diary of my life and may be useful sometime in the future. With the second bronze star added to his expeditionary medal and a new Nicaraguan campaign medal, the indefatigable young campaigner returned to Panama and his family. His second son, Thomas Richard, was born in October 1913. With Woodrow Wilson in the White House, war clouds loomed over with Mexico when bandit General Victoriano Huerta overthrew legally elected Mexican President Francisco Madero. In an angry exchange of notes, Wilson insisted that Huerta must hold new elections, barring himself as a candidate. Wilson's choice was Huerta's rival for power, General Venustiano Carranza. Banning all arms shipments to Mexico, the president asked all Americans without urgent business there to leave the country and sent the fleet to cruise significantly in the Gulf of Mexico during a period of watchful waiting. Defying Wilson, Huerta began importing arms from Europe to crush Carranza. The president then violated his own embargo and rushed American arms to the Carranza forces. A full-scale fighting broke out all over Mexico, in which American industrial property was destroyed, and United States businessmen were compelled to flee attacks against them from both sides. In January 1914, the Marines were ordered from Panama to the fleet standing off Veracruz. Ethel Butler took the children home to Pennsylvania, and her husband reported to the fleet flagship Florida, assigned to the staff of Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher. Welcoming him aboard, the admiral remarked on his courage and daring in the Chinese, Philippine, and Nicaraguan campaigns. He was just the man, the admiral thought, for a dangerous special mission for the War Department. How did Butler feel about going into Mexico as a civilian spy to make expert analysis of Huerta's fighting forces in and around Mexico City, and as well as to gather general intelligence in case war was declared? He would carry no official orders of any kind, of course, and if he were caught, the Navy would have to disavow any knowledge of either him or his mission. "How soon can I start, Admiral?" he asked. Beneath the night sky of swollen black clouds, as most of the crew above the Florida watched a Western movie starring Bronco Billy, a civilian-clad butler dropped a small traveling bag out of his cabin port into a small boat, then slipped off the ship after it. His disappearance from the Florida was carried on the ship's rolls as desertion. Ashore in Veracruz, he decided to disguise himself as an Englishman. There were many English in Mexico at the time, traveling on business. Attiring himself in a tweed suit, spats, deerstalker hat, and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses with a black ribbon, he undertook a stage English accent. A fraudulent British passport and forged letters of introduction to important Britons in Mexico City completed his impersonation. He left Veracruz aboard the private railroad car of the line's superintendent, a secret Carranza supporter cooperating with the Americans. The train rolled toward Mexico City, along the road American troops would use if they invaded. The superintendent, stopping the train several times en route, letting Butler inspect electric power plants and reservoirs by introducing him to leading citizens as Mr. Johnson, a public utilities expert. Managing to stray inside some army forts on his own, he was apprehended several times, but released. "I carried only a butterfly net and studied rocks," he grinned in recollection. "They thought I was a nut and let me pass." In Mexico City, he changed to American garb and posed as a private detective from the United States, seeking a condemned murderer who had escaped and fled to Mexico. Mexican secret police escorted him to all the garrisons to help his search for the imaginary criminal. He soon had vital data on the troop strength and disposition of musicians' dumps around Mexico City. Making military maps of everything he had seen, Butler buried them in the false bottom of his bag and took the train back to Veracruz. He became aware that 2 Mexicans were following him. Apparently, he had aroused suspicions, and the Mexican Secret Service was keeping an eye on him. In the early morning, when the train reached Veracruz, it paused temporarily to allow a rail switch to be thrown that took it into the station. During this pause, Butler went to the washroom in pajamas, his bag concealed under his bathrobe. Locking the door behind him, he slipped out of the train window. He donned his clothes in the freight yard and sped to the American consulate to contact Admiral Fletcher. 2 naval officers were sent ashore to the consulate. He turned over all his maps and data to them, and then left separately, dressed once more in his British guise. Seeking to board a British steamer at the wharf to port down the coast, for which he would secretly be picked up and brought back to the Florida, he was suddenly seized by a squad of police. They considered it odd for a British entomologist to have been visiting the American embassy. His bag was opened and searched thoroughly, but nothing incriminating was found. Threatening "E blighters" with official reprisals from the British Foreign Office, Butler bluffed them back into letting him go. A few days later, he was safely back aboard the Florida, where Admiral Fletcher warmly congratulated him on the success of his daring mission.